introduction. And I'm just told that it's recording. I would like to thank Michele, Emma Baisal, and Rana Özbal for inviting me to participate in this ARWA webinar series on Anatolian identities, which I'm sure we all followed with great interest. And I would like to also thank the audience for their presence. For some of you, it's Thursday evening. For some of you, it's Thursday morning, whichever time zone you find yourself in. Thank you. So, a little bit of introduction to help. Let me just figure out how to change the slide. All right, there we go. A little bit of introduction to sort of place us in space and time after we've been covering many different topics in this lecture series. So the Hittite polity flourished in central Anatolia for a period just shy of 500 years from its formation in around 1650 BCE in the area within the bend of the Kızılırmak River to its subsequent demise in the late 12th century BCE. Though both the origins and the demise of the Hittite states remain unclear, the rich, if patchy, textual and archaeological record allow us to trace its formation into an empire that extended in its heyday from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to northern Syria and northwestern Mesopotamia, and whose rulers, a list of whom you see on the left, exercised sovereignty over diverse territories, cultures, and politics and polities. We study Hittite civilization, as we call it today, through its extant material culture, recovered from several archaeological sites in Anatolia and beyond, as well as the textual record it left behind, which includes around 30,000 clay tablets written in cuneiform, dozens of monuments inscribed with Anatolian hieroglyphs, and thousands of seals and their impressions bearing, let's say seal impressions mostly, bearing one or both of these scripts. It is well known for those of us who study Hittite Anatolia that the textual and archaeological record at our disposal is as incomplete as it is unevenly distributed. Archaeological investigations have focused almost exclusively on central locations and their elite quarters and have yielded a material record closely associated with the state. The extant textual and glyptic record recovered from the state archives of these central locations appear to have been produced exclusively by the state and for the state. In the meantime, there are several types of evidence we do not yet have. For instance, to name a few, we lack material cultural evidence from small settlements, such as villages or hamlets, or from domestic contexts. Cemeteries in Hittite Anatolia are rare, and our knowledge of funerary practices is extremely patchy. It is limited, on the one hand, to a few cemeteries, most of which have been dated to the earlier half of the second millennium BCE, and have been described as belonging to the lower classes, although this is something that I think requires further thought. And on the other hand, we have a little bit of information in this connection on Hittite royal funerary rituals that are transmitted in the textual record, and this, along with references to royal mausolea, constitute pretty much what we know about their burial practices. In the realm of texts, there are yet, let's say, bigger gaps. There is, for instance, only limited economic documentation, and more unfortunate yet, no private archives. And this is something that clearly distinguishes Hittite documentation from other places and periods in Mesopotamia, where we have significant private documentation and economic documentation. As will hopefully be clearer throughout the course of this lecture, the unevenness of the evidence, or in other words, the pronounced concentration of the evidence on the central Hittite state, naturally affects how we study social identities. It not only affects the scale and context of the inquiry, but also the data sets that we have at our disposal and the data sets that we prioritize in the study of identity. This lecture will have two parts. In the first part, I will engage with the empirical and methodological challenges in studying identity in Late Bronze Age or Hittite Anatolia. I will start out with a brief overview of the history of scholarship on social identities in Hittite studies, with particular attention to issues related to the terminology and analytical categories that have influenced our lines of inquiry, as well as our historical explanations. In the second part, I will consider the role of social identities in the process of Hittite imperialism and will explore the notion that the Hittite empire cultivated an overarching and multifaceted Hittite political identity, which was implemented through discursive, material, and performative strategies traceable in the textual and archaeological records, and which had possibly distinct socio-political, legal, and economic ramifications. I will further explore the notion that a keen sense of homeland was integral to Hittite political and religious ideology and may have served as a critical metaphor for a fundamentally place-bound Hittite identity. We will have several chances to discuss this throughout the lecture and later on in the Q&A, I hope, but in the following, I will mainly use the term Hittite in reference to the Late Bronze Age polity centered in Hattusha. I use Hittite Anatolia to, and I recognize that this is a problematic term, but it's easy to refer to regions and periods in which the Hittite polity was active, not only, mostly in the core territory, but not only that. I will use it also in reference to its borderlands, the borderlands of its vast territory. Anatolia has long been conceptualized as a bridge that facilitates the movement of people, ideas, and materials, a meeting point and melting pot of peoples, cultures, and languages. The Hittite world was particularly, and perhaps justifiably, has a significant role in the conceptualization of Anatolia as a crossroads of languages and cultures and a bridge between several different worlds, to quote my colleague Gius Fredi, possibly because of its role as an interface between the Aegean or the Hellenic Aegean and the Near East, the Mesopotamian Near East. The bridge metaphor itself has come under scrutiny in recent scholarship for a number of reasons, but above all for its reliance on the binaries East and West, for its representation of Anatolia and its peoples as transitory and peripheral, and also on account of its late 19th and early 20th century ideological underpinnings, which have been discussed in recent literature including Yazıcıoğlu 2007, Fondasso 2020, Alaura 2022. Nevertheless, the conceptual premise of Anatolia as a region characterized by diversity and contact remains salient in current scholarship on the history and archaeology of Hittite Anatolia. Identity, culture, contact or cultural contact, and diversity have frequently been invoked as explanatory forces in scholarly discourse on the social, political, and cultural history of Late Bronze Age Anatolia and the Hittite state. It is generally accepted, following Hans Gustav Güterbock's pioneering work on the definition of the term Hittite, in which he sought to establish terminological clarity, that the so-called Hittite civilization is a mixed culture, not to be equated with a single ethnic group. And this civilization was, this civilization is conceived of as being made up of various substrata associated with distinct regional or cultural milieu that are named after textually attested Late Bronze Age geopolitical regions like Kizzuwatna or Artsawa, or more commonly, the languages and linguistic communities prominent in these areas, such as Luvian, Hattic, or Hurrian. As outlined by Jörg Klinger in his seminal 1996 monograph on the Hattic cult stratum, or Kultschicht in German, the idea of strata was originally introduced by Emil Forer in the 1920s. Forer worked with the assumption that each linguistic stratum identified in the textual record on the basis of several traits, but particularly incantations, theonyms, or place names, corresponded to a distinct people, or Bevölkerung in German. And this idea was quickly taken up by prominent Hittitologists, among them, for instance, Albrecht Goetze. A particular preoccupation in Hittite studies was, especially in the study of the richly documented Hittite religion, has been to detect foreign influences on Hittite culture by tracing texts, literary motifs, gods, or ritual gestures to their geographical, cultural, or presumed ethnolinguistic origins. And here I quote an early Güterbock: "Our task then will be to ascribe, as far as possible, the individual myths to these various ethnolinguistic groups." So one good example. In recent scholarship, the term Kultschicht has been replaced by milieu upon the suggestion of Charles Steidler, to whom the term Kultschicht had connotations of a temporal layering, like archaeological strata. So he thought, and a lot of people, including me, agree that milieu might have been a better way of conceptualizing this. And this concept of distinct milieu is particularly prominent in the study of Hittite religion, which nowadays, as opposed to earlier scholarship, prioritize different issues such as textual transmission or the study of dialects, particularly of Luvian dialects, for instance, and their transmission in the Hittite religious textual record. In its wider ancient Near Eastern context, the Late Bronze Age Anatolia has often been described as a multicultural, multi-ethnic periphery receptive to influences from the outside, especially from Syria and Mesopotamia. And Anatolia's diversity and its position as a contact zone is thought to have affected Hittite attitudes and approaches towards groups perceived as foreign or other. And the Hittite Empire has been credited with an openness and tolerance towards foreigners and foreign cultures, with respect, even eagerness towards foreign religions, and which was seemingly uncharacteristic of its counterparts in the ancient Near East. This presumed tolerant and accepting attitude towards the foreign has generally been explained as a consequence of the intrinsic and presumed ethnic and cultural diversity of Hittite Anatolia. And it is also interesting to note here that Indo-European speaking groups have themselves been viewed in some modern scholarship implicitly or explicitly as strangers in a strange land, who, upon entering central Anatolia sometime in the 3rd millennium BC, adapted to the native Anatolian cultures, and adapted so thoroughly that had there not been the Indo-European linguistic evidence, their arrival or existence could not have been detected in the archaeological record. Some of these ideas, of course, have been fiercely debated in recent scholarship. Alongside this predominant view of cultural diversity in Hatti and tolerance towards foreigners, the same data set has engendered a rather different perspective. A number of studies have postulated a sharp distinction between what is culturally Hittite and what is not, constructing binaries of between self and other, or civilized and barbarian, often in reference to certain groups in the north, such as the people called Kaska, or the region known as Atsi or Hayasa. And this tendency is particularly evident in how the Kaska, for instance, have been depicted in modern scholarship, and judging from frequent references to them as barbarians or unruly or pestering people, tribes, it seems that they are viewed by modern scholars as politically less evolved, culturally and technologically backward populations. And in a similar vein, it has been argued that the Hittites, like the Mesopotamians, could view the views and the ways of others as somewhat distasteful. Archaeological approaches to the question of cultural diversity, foreigners or foreignness in Hittite Anatolia have led to an altogether different line of questioning and interpretation, or in more than one. There is, for instance, in secondary literature, a great emphasis on the homogeneity of the material culture in the core territory under control, and that there's this idea of homogeneity, which we see, for instance, in discussions of pottery as standardization. Again, there are backlashes to these ideas, well, and counter arguments have been developed about, how we over-interpret this homogeneity. But in addition to that, the scarcity of foreign objects in the archaeological record of Anatolia, and the dearth of material cultural markers of Hittite imperial presence outside of the empire's core territory have been brought into this debate. And this general picture of material homogeneity stands in sharp contrast to the picture presented by the textual record, which suggests instead that the Hittite state, quite diverse to begin with, was in continuous, intensive contact with the outside world through imperial expansion, diplomacy, and population movements, and actively pursued knowledge from a number of different lands outside of central Anatolia, within or outside of Anatolia, within or without the bounds of its empire, especially in the areas of scribal education, literature, cults, magic, medicine, and divination. One interpretation of this uneven distribution and coverage of the textual and archaeological data, considered alongside the overall sparseness of textual references to state-sponsored or private trade, has been that trade was of minor economic or social significance for the Hittite polity. Yet another idea that is in the process of being revised by several colleagues. Let us ask ourselves, what's in a name? Why is this important? Most modern representations of Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age are peopled by groups that embody overlapping linguistic and cultural traits, as well as social, particularly ethnic identities. These groups are often called by modern exonyms, which in turn are modernized names for ancient languages. They are, moreover, frequently labeled and treated as ethnolinguistic entities. as Hittitologist Silvia Alaura's work on the history of Hittitology as a discipline has demonstrated, this trend goes back to the very beginning of our field, to the early 20th century conviction that a particular ethnic group, then called race, must have created the Hittite Empire. The identity of this group or race was the earliest preoccupation of nascent Hittitology. This so-called Hittite problem, which revolved around who or what the Hittites were, was considered solved by Bedřich Hrozný when he identified the predominantly attested language of the empire as the Indo-European language we now call Hittite. So the problem was solved once, the name, once this entity was connected to a language. Fast forward to the present, there are very few studies on social identity of any kind in Hittite scholarship, something you can verify with a quick keyword search through online bibliographies available via the Hittite portal, for instance. The question of identity in general and ethnic identity in particular often comes to the fore in the prolific and ever-growing literature on the Luvians, yet the idea of alluvian identity has only very recently been problematized in an article that you see here by Christoph Bachhuber. Hittite ethnicity itself has repeatedly and convincingly been called into question since Güterbock's seminal article on the definition of the term Hittite. And the methodological and conceptual issues that arise from looking for ethnicity in Anatolia have been clearly laid out, for instance, in the work of Amir Gilan. And here you see his article, whose work on Hittite ethnicity is deservedly much cited, though its implications have had relatively little impact. In the wider context of ancient Near Eastern studies too, the use of personal names as indicators of language as the primary criterion of ethnicity, and the assumption of an overlap between language, ethnicity, and cultural traits have been criticized based on both theoretical considerations and comparative case studies. For a very good take on this, centering on Alalah, you can refer to Nation Building in the Plain of Antioch by Eva von Dasso. Nevertheless, the idea that the diverse socio-cultural makeup of Hittite Anatolia was composed of distinct cultural, linguistic, and ethnic units that can objectively be identified by language or any other cultural trait has remained entrenched in Hittite studies. That language is still considered the key variable in identifying distinct people in Hittite studies may be observed in the frequency with which the term ethnolinguistic is used. And interestingly, it seems to me that the term ethnolinguistic has become a sort of safer or less problematic alternative to plain ethnic or ethnicity, just like ethnicity had earlier replaced race as an analytical category in scholarship after the 1940s. My purpose in my slides are in this order. My purpose in drawing attention to terminologies such as Hittite, Luvian, or ethnolinguistic is not what, and I've said this before, not what an esteemed colleague and friend of mine, Ilya Yakubovic, has recently described as, and I quote, lightly canceling erroneous ethnolinguistic terminology, end quote. I do agree that it doesn't really matter whether we refer to the primary language of Hattusha as Hittite, which is a modern term, or as Nesite, which is based on the ancient name of the language or an adverb that describes linguistic behavior, Nesili, so long as it is clear that we are referring to a language. One could justifiably refer to Hittite pottery, as opposed to the less Hittite-centric epithet North Central Anatolian, in order to emphasize the central role the Hittite Empire played in the production and circulation of this pottery. And As I will argue in the second part of my lecture, we can talk about perhaps a Hittite socio-political identity, Hittite culture, or a Hittite worldview, especially if the link to their context as the Hittite polity is clear. The same term, however, may be considered problematic when applied, for instance, to the landscape monuments in the aggregate, since some of them were not created by agents of the Hittite state, and the context and history of their development are still debated. So one has to be careful in its application, but it is not. It is most of all important to call into question the uncritical application of the term ethnolinguistic as an analytical category and its conceptual and interpretive impact. So if we go from ethnic to ethnolinguistic, one has to go through certain clarifications. Ethnicity is a process of social differentiation through self-identification based on subjective criteria. The principal criteria being a belief in shared ancestry and often a common place of origin. Although some recent scholarship have added or have lessened the emphasis on like shared territory and added other traits that are constructed as being vital to people's ethnic identities. Its boundaries are porous and its membership is elective. This process occurs in contact, often in contact and or conflict situations, and often around states or in the context of state formation. And in fact, I think it was Jeff Emberling who had argued that ethnicity is a type of social identity that always sort of operates against the state or below the level of the state. And it's not a state identity, but it is closely associated with it. Specific cultural traits or language may be selected by the group in the formation and expression of its identity. And lastly, ethnic identity is not necessarily the only identity or affiliation of an individual or group. Ethnic identity can overlap with different kinds of identity, just as individuals or groups may have more than one ethnic identity that they choose to articulate in different contexts. And the saliency, the prominence of a particular identity is contingent. Ethnicity, therefore, cannot be identified based on objective criteria, but only through subjective criteria, what is referred to as the emic perspective. And therefore, in order for a category such as ethnolinguistic to be analytically meaningful, the association between language and identity must be established. In other words, the subjective value of language or any other cultural traits as an indicator for the expression or formation of ethnic or other kinds of social identity must be demonstrated. The data at our disposal can be rather uncooperative. It bears repeating that the textual and archaeological evidence is distributed unevenly across time and space, leaving us with significant geographical and chronological gaps. And not only that, as I stated just before, most of both data sets, archaeological and textual, have been commissioned or produced by the state and its agents and for the state. Taken at face value, they present us with a markedly unilateral centralist narrative or narratives. And the difficulties of extracting identity in general or ethnicity in particular from material culture are well known and much repeated. And while texts are generally considered more suitable for investigations of identity, with the idea that identity is discursively constructed, texts too present a significant challenge, since introspective reflections on how those who produce the text identified themselves and others in different times, places, or situations are rare, if not entirely non-existent. Still, we shouldn't suggest, and I'm certainly not suggesting, we don't consider ethnicity at all. On the contrary, there are interesting cases to consider. Several scholars have suggested an ethnic basis of affiliation among the population groups referred to as Hurrian in our texts. And similarly, we may find perhaps evidence for a process of ethnic identity formation, a process also known as ethnogenesis, in the context of the interactions between the Hittite state and populations called Kashga in the Black Sea region. In the remaining time, I would like to pursue a different line of inquiry. Putting aside any a priori notions of ethnolinguistic categories, I would like to explore the role of social identity in the process of Hittite imperialism. And here I will explore, as a working hypothesis, the notion that the Hittite Empire cultivated this overarching and multifaceted Hittite identity, and further argued that this was linked to a keen sense of homeland that was central to Hittite political and religious ideology. And this was a sort of reference point and a metaphor for a fundamentally place-bound Hittite identity. So I would like to emphasize that we observe this Hittite identity, if such existed, during the process of its formation or its creation and maintenance and articulation, and this wasn't something that was ready-made, that existed from the beginning of the Hittite Empire. And so there will be changes observable in how this is articulated and how this is constructed if we look at it from a diachronic point of view. Let us review a selection of the evidence that we can use for this argument. Hittite texts refer to the Hittite polity and its core territory, that is, the area under direct Hittite control, as the land of the city Hattusa, more commonly written cartographically as the land of Hatti. The Hittite equivalent is generally thought to be Hattusa's Utne. Similarly, in modern parlance, we refer to the Hittite polity or core territory of Hatti, or the core territory as Hatti, or Hatti land, or the land of Hatti, as a sort of shorthand, rather than saying the land of the Hittite, the land of the city Hattusa. So the reference to Hatti in modern scholarship is actually a particular textually transmitted way of referring to this polity and its territory. This notion of a land of Hatti actually predated the Hittite Empire. The name Hattum is attested in the Old Assyrian record as the designation for the territory around the town Hattush, which was the name of the city Hattusha in the Old Assyrian period, or in the Karum period, however we would like to call it. And this Hattum constituted an area that later corresponded to part of what was conceptualized as the land of Hatti in the subsequent Hittite period. I would argue, although the Old Assyrian use of the term Hattum as a geographical area or as a political category needs further elaboration, the use of this term in the Hittite Empire was different. The Hittite Empire invested it with a different set of meanings and used it in a different way. As a territory, the land of Hatti lacks clear geographical definition in both Hittite sources and modern studies on Hittite historical geography. With the capital Hattusha at its center, it appears to have corresponded roughly to the Kızılırmak River basin and was often juxtaposed in Hittite texts with other lands in Anatolia, such as Kaska, Luka, or Artsawa, or Kitsuvatna. And it is important to emphasize that in Hittite geographical imagination, the land of Hatti was more than just a geographical space, but it was a particular combination or network of natural and built spaces, and most importantly, the socio-political communities that it inhabited. So it represented not only the space, but this network that brought together the communities as well as its natural elements. As illustrated by this particular passage that you see from a composition concerning kingship. In Hittite political discourse, the Hittite king was seen as or was represented as the divinely appointed ruler of the land of Hatti, entrusted with the governance of this land, with the governance of the land of Hatti by the storm god, who was, at least in certain contexts, viewed as the true owner of the land. It is an oft-cited passage, but reads beautifully. May the Tabarna, the king, be dear to the gods. The land belongs to the storm god alone. Heaven, earth, and the people belong to the storm god alone. He has made the Labarna, the king, his administrator, and given him the entire land of Hatti. The Labarna shall continue to administrate with his hand the entire land. May the storm god destroy whoever should approach the person of Labarna, the king, and the borders of Hatti. In religious discourse, the land of Hatti was distinct from other foreign lands by virtue of being the home of the gods of Hatti, and was characterized by distinct cult traditions. As we see in the following excerpt from the prayer of the royal couple Arnawanda and Asmunikal to the sun goddess of Arina, one of the highest ranking deities of the Hittite pantheon, the land of Hatti was conceived as the only place where the gods were properly taken care of. Another very well-known but worth repeating passage: for you, O gods, only the land of Hatti is a truly pure land. For you, we continuously give pure, great, and fine sacrifices only in the land of Hatti. For you, O gods, only in the land of Hatti we continuously establish respect. And the Hittite homeland was dotted with numerous places sacred to the gods, natural, man-made, or some sort of combination of the two, which were visited regularly by the rulers of Hatti during various state-sponsored religious festivals, and which were very much at the heart of several local cult traditions. And as has been noted before, the investment of Hittite rulers in upholding the cults of Hatti are clearly reflected in the rich documentation pertaining to the Hittite cult, which amounts to about half of all extant Hittite texts. And these include festival texts describing various aspects of state-sponsored cult festivals and the participation of the royal family, as well as the so-called cult inventories that concern the observation and management of local cults. It is interesting to note that the cult inventories appear to have been composed for the purpose of collecting information and reporting on local religious practices and institutions, and that the information in these texts are organized geographically. So they are, in a sense, geographical narratives and document the local cults of the core territory of the Hittite polity. So they are concerned primarily, as my colleagues Michele Camarosano and Adam Christian, who have worked on these texts from several different aspects, have noted, they are deeply concerned with the cult traditions, the local cult traditions of the area that we understand, that of the land of Hatti, this core territory of Hatti. And this association of the land of Hatti, not only with a territory or a polity, but actual cultural practices. And I chose religious discourse and religion as one one example of this. There are hints at other type of cultural practices that are associated with, Hittite or like the land of Hatti that we may further discuss in the Q&A. The association with these particular cult practices sort of moves us closer to the idea that the land of Hatti was invested with the particular meaning of a homeland, and that this homeland stands in the center of this of political and Hittite discourse as articulated in the textual record. I would further suggest, moving on, that the land of Hatti served as the reference point to an overarching Hittite political identity, which corresponded to a distinct legal status with incumbent rights and obligations. And we may trace this political affiliation in references to men and occasionally women of the land of Hattusha. And this designation indicated, as I've recently argued elsewhere, modes of community affiliation and political participation, which we may understand as a developing Hittite citizenship. In other words, men and women of the land of Hattusha were subjects of the Hittite king and inhabitants, perhaps even native inhabitants and citizens of the land of Hattusha. And in the aggregate, these men and women of Hatti could refer to a distinct political community that actually had and exercised considerable political agency that can be traced in the textual record. Are there any indications to sort of support this, to further support this notion that men and women of Hatti did not only relate to the state as subjects or subjects of the Hittite king, but as citizens, and that native citizenship or being part of the Hittite homeland, being an inhabitant of the land of Hatti, can perhaps be indicated in a reference that I recently found, so I hadn't considered this before, in a well-known document, CTH 123, which is a Hittite treaty with an unknown partner. It is well known for several reasons, but there is a reference in it in the context of the Hittite king discussing possible transgressions against him, a reference to my internal and external subjects. This suggests to me that there was a distinction in Hittite political conceptualization and practice between subjects that were internal, which suggests like an insider group, and in my view, an association with this homeland territory, and external subjects, those who were subjects of the Hittite king, but not necessarily part of or native inhabitants or citizens of the land of Hatti. However, the Hittite Empire was superimposed over a political landscape of towns, and in the process of the development of this Hittite political identity, the Hittite Empire did not eradicate local town-based socio-political identities. On the contrary, in a diverse range of Hittite sources, most of the inhabitants of central Anatolia, in several different contexts, were commonly identified either individually or in groups by reference to their towns. Affiliation with a town or with the Hittite polity were not necessarily incompatible with one another. Rather, the latter superseded the former in a sort of nested hierarchy. This can be observed in the excerpt that you see at the very bottom from the document known as the Deeds of Supililiuma, in which the men of the town Kurushtama are qualified also as sons of the land of Hattusha or Hatti. The storm god took the man, here to be understood as men in plural, of Kurushtama, a son, to be understood as sons of Hatti, and carried him, again, understand them, to the land of Egypt and made them men of Egypt. Now, whether there's a distinction between the men and women of Hatti versus like a native, like a son of Hatti, a child of Hatti, is something that requires further investigation and possibly within the dictionary, in the Hittite dictionary archives. My suspicion is that they more or less had the same meaning, but the usage dumumesh kur uruhati was a practice that may have been borrowed from northern Syria, where this particular way of referring to the citizens or members of a political community as sons appears to have been prominent. But as I said, if there was a distinction between the two ways of referring to people, like as men or sons of Hatti, it requires further thought, as I've been discussing with my colleague Giulia Tori recently. The question then is let me just go back here. Yes. The formation of this political identity and Hittite citizenship was probably an integral aspect of Hittite state formation and imperial expansion, and this developed hand in hand with the creation of this idea of a Hittite homeland that I argued was a central part of political and religious ideology. Now, there are a further question that we can explore in the remaining time is something that is still, let me go here first, that I'm still exploring and trying to bring into this debate. And that is, we have looked at how identity was articulated in the textual record in Hittite political or religious discourses, briefly here, but there are more examples. But how was it articulated in the material record? There are several different aspects of material culture that have actually been discussed in relation to this topic as, markers of Hittite imperial presence or Hittite identity. But I would like to mention a recent take on this by, or two recent takes on this. One has to do, or one was developed by Andreas Schachner, and in his recent research, Schachner considers settlement patterns, urban planning and architecture, and transformations of the natural landscape, not only in the capital Hattusha, but also in the rest of Anatolia, which includes both newly founded sites and those that continued from the Middle Bronze Age, as part of the state's efforts to control this territory, but also to create a particular Hittite identity. He argues that the development of indigenous architectural forms, for instance, that clearly break from previous periods, such as the Old Assyrian period, and the reshaping of the natural environment and the use of prominent elements of the natural landscape, such as rocky outcrops, as the setting of public buildings, administrative institutions or religious buildings, not only reflected this, the use of this building program to demonstrate the presence and power of the Hittite ruling dynasty, but also to create an indigenous Hittite identity. And similarly, though, this is something we can further discuss in the Q&A, another, pottery, for instance, and its use has commonly been invoked as possibly a constituent of of the building of a Hittite identity, and may reflect certain performances and comments and like eating and feasting practices that may have actually been a means of articulating and performing this forming Hittite identity. Now, instead of, I realize that I'm reaching the end of my time and will close. So instead of a concluding thoughts, I would like to pose some concluding questions, particularly one question. And if we can indeed find evidence for the creation of this Hittite identity, this did it work? Did this actually was this accepted by at least certain Hittite communities or communities of Hittite Anatolia? Here, I might go back to yet another textual, another textstelle, another paragraph that actually might have a bearing on this. This is from a cult inventory concerning Gursa Masa, and it concerns, describes the festivities at this particular passage for the god Yari. I've sort of bolded the parts that are relevant to us within this. The described cult practices in the town Gursa Masa, which is probably somewhere in the west or southwest, at the time when they celebrate the autumn festival for the storm god. They do all sorts of things, but importantly, they divide the young man into two groups and name them. They call half of them men of Hatti, and they call the other half of them men of Masa. The men of Hatti have weapons of bronze, whereas the men of Masa have weapons of reed. They fight. The men of Hatti win. They take captive and consign him to the gods. So this, and I'm looking for further evidence that I can use in this connection, definitely corroborates or at least suggests the notion that the idea of men of Hatti was not just a top-down idea that was that you see only in Hittite political or religious discourse, but might have been relevant to the people, to at least certain communities in Hittite Anatolia who may have referred to themselves in a performative setting as men of Hatti. Of course, we might then ask, like, how local was this custom, or was this something that was related to the Hittite state? That's another issue to discuss. In considering whether and to what an extent this Hittite identity worked, I will finally like to refer to two different ideas. One of it has been developed by Norman Yaffe in respect to the Assyrian practice of mass deportations that contributed to the empire's collapse, which has recently sort of been applied to the disintegration of the Hittite Empire. The argument that Claudio Glatz, for instance, articulated was that deported populations, which are very well documented in the Hittite case, bore no cultural or political allegiance to the Hittite Empire. So although we don't have enough evidence to know whether these deported populations were ever integrated into state orders, there's this idea that they never totally conformed to any program of social cohesion initiated by the Hittite Empire, and actually either contributed to or were indifferent to the disintegration of the Hittite Empire. And recently, some archaeological evidence, perhaps might be mentioned in this connection, and that has to do with archaeological evidence from the Hittite borderlands of very different types of painted pottery, for instance, that may have been or that may be interpreted as ways of or as, let's say, not conforming to Hittite pottery production practices. But this is, again, something that we can discuss further on. With that, I conclude my talk, and I'm looking forward to questions. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ilgi. It was great, and there's a lot of food for thought. I think I really appreciate the whole discussion of ethnolinguistic grouping, which is, I think, very problematic from an archaeological point of view as well. So I hope that we can just explore it a little bit more in the Q&A. Maybe before opening for questions, actually, if I may have my own question, which is, I really like the idea of this nested political identity that revolves first around the city or around the settlement or around the place. And actually, as an Italian, I feel that that is very much the case. And I think it has to do, for Italy, it has to do with the fact that the unification of Italy was very late, and it was actually a conglomeration of small states and city-states. And I think that the process of Hittite political creation is similar in a sense. So it was like a Pac-Man going phagocytating other small states. So my question here would be that the only, as far as I know, the only toponym that seems to represent more than a single city-state or a single settlement is actually Hattusha, the land of Hattusha, right? And it seems to expand in time. It seems to expand in size, and I wonder whether that is the case. And I wonder, for example, why in the Taruntasha treaties, Pitasha, Usha are still outside of the land of Hatti. So how were they conceiving belonging to the land of Hatti?
I'm not sure I understood what you meant as like the Hattusha being the only toponym that's used in this respect, like as a sort of representative of the entire land, because that was common practice in the Late Bronze Age to have.
No. Okay, but it sort of Hatti, the land. I mean, the land of I don't know, Itasha is actually referring to something that is probably relatively small and that corresponds, possibly, as far as I can say, refers to an area when Pitasha was a small city-state or a small kingdom. I don't know exactly how to call it. But was the land of Hatti expand incredibly over time? Right. So there are two different processes, maybe.
Yes, and I would have to say that the use of the term land of Hatti, especially in, I've also considered the case of Pitassa because it's I think there are indications that at that particular time, its affiliation with the, or at least throughout its existence, its political affiliation with the land of Hatti was very much in constant flux, because there was always like there were people in Pitasha who wanted different alliances, for instance. So we have to look in these contexts at whether the term is being used as a sort of more in a geographical sense or as a political sense. And I would say this of course requires further thought, but one does suspect that although it's the same term, it's used as a space and its use as a polity can be distinguished in the textual record. So when you look at it, you have to think about, are they talking about a particular area, or are they talking about like affiliation with the polity? So I think that could be a helpful approach, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording in the meanwhile.